Okay, now, as to just where Dr. West had proposed to have his neuropsychiatric institute located, and keep in mind his connections to Jack Ruby and the CIA through the LSD experiments performed under MK-ULTRA, we're going to read you from a book called Mind Control. Mind Control was authored by a man named Peter Schrag, S-C-H-R-A-G. It's published in hardcover by Pantheon Books and copyrighted in 1978.
All right, now continuing again with the subject just dealt with in the last book, which is Lewis, Jolly, and West, and the Center for Diagnosis, the Diagnostic Centers proposed by Irvin Mark et al. And on January 22nd, Schrag writes, 11 days after Reagan's speech, and 2 days after Richard M. Nixon's second inaugural, West, that's Dr. Lewis, Jolly, and West, followed up with a friendly letter to his friend J.M. Stubblebine, M.D., then the state's director of health. Dear Stubb, the letter starts, I am in possession of confidential information that the Army is prepared to turn over Nike missile bases to state and local agencies for non-military purposes. They may look with special favor on health-related applications. Such a Nike missile base is located in the Santa Monica Mountains, within a half-hour's drive of the Neuropsychiatric Institute. It is accessible, but relatively remote. The site is securely fenced and includes various buildings and improvements making it suitable for prompt occupancy. If this site were made available to the Neuropsychiatric Institute as a research facility, perhaps initially as an adjunct to the new Center for the Prevention of Violence, we could put it to very good use. Comparative studies could be carried out there in an isolated but convenient location of experimental or model programs for the alteration of undesirable behavior. Such programs might include control of drug or alcohol abuse, modification of chronic antisocial or impulsive aggressiveness, etc. The site could also accommodate conferences or retreats for instruction of selected groups of mental health-related professionals and of others, e.g. law enforcement personnel, parole officers, special educators, for whom both demonstration and participation would be effective modes of instruction. My understanding is that a direct request by the governor or other appropriate officers of the state to the Secretary of Defense, or, of course, the President, would be most likely to produce prompt results. Although West's letter did not specify precisely what sorts of, quote, undesirable behavior he had in mind, how the, quote, alterations were to be accomplished, or why a, quote, securely fenced Nike missile site would be appropriate, the general objectives of the Violence Center had been extensively outlined in West's earlier proposals.
And a little later on, Schrag talks about some of the institutions which were going to be backing Dr. West here. This was far more than just a state institution. West had ample reason to expect support. He had the backing of the governor and the state's health and welfare agency. He had received promises of cooperation from a number of California prisons and mental institutions. He had many staff members who had long pursued independent research programs on life-threatening behavior, unquote, and he had secured tentative approval for a grant of $750,000 from the U.S. Law Enforcement Assistance Administration through the California Council on Criminal Justice, and for another $250,000 from other sources. He was also hopeful that other funds would be provided by the National Institute of Mental Health, which, like LEAA, had become increasingly interested in developing effective technologies of behavior control. Now, it's worth noting that this center was never established, and there was a storm of protest, which Nip is going to read you about in a second. We're going to engage in a little bit of speculation or rumination about just about some of the events that might have sprung from this, however.
Indeed. Continuing with mind control. And yet, despite all that, the Violence Center never really managed to get underway, never got the Nike missile site, and never got its funding. The proposal was too ingenuously blatant, and the timing, which seemed so right in the winter of 1973, the season of Nixon's last and greatest triumph, appeared all wrong a few months later. Protests that began early in 1973 among students and faculty on the UCLA campus, among them several members of Jolly West's own staff at the Neuropsychiatric Institute, reached the California legislature, which threatened to investigate, and which blocked the state funding, which had been so certain a few months earlier. The decision, said Earl Bryan, Reagan's Secretary of Health and Welfare, represented, quote, and mind you, he's talking about the decision to block the funding, The decision, said Earl Bryan, Reagan's Secretary of Health and Welfare, represented, quote, a callous disregard for public safety. Meanwhile, partly as a consequence of pressure from civil liberties organizations, LEAA announced that it had banned the use of its funds, quote, for psychosurgery, medical research, behavior modification, including aversion therapy, and chemotherapy. So, in 1973, we find that the Violence Center and its proposed Nike missile-based site is turned down, mainly because, as so often happens, people found out about these things, and when people do find out about things, that seems to be the only way some of these things are ever stopped. Otherwise, it probably would have been ticking promptly along.
Now, a couple of things to take note of in the passage Nip just read you. First of all, that you heard a reference to Dr. Earl Bryan, the California Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. I believe that was his title, or Health and Education. At any rate, Dr. Earl Bryan was very close to, among others, Ed Meese, who was Reagan's legal counselor, and Earl Bryan's name surfaced in connection with the legal tangle surrounding Ed Meese. Remember, his name is now being put in nomination again for being Attorney General, the highest law enforcement official of the land, and basically, Dr. Earl Bryan was one of the people involved in the financial shenanigans around Ed Meese. So this is a connection which goes on to this day. Now, in the year 1973, which was the year that the Neuropsychiatric Institute project at the Nike missile bases was turned down, that was the very same year, interestingly enough, in which a fellow named George Philip Blakey placed down the initial $650,000 deposit in Guyana for the People's Temple. Now, the People's Temple moved from California, where it began, down to Guyana in 1973, in this year, and a number of people have suggested that when the official plans for the study for the prevention of violent behavior down at the Nike missile bases were turned down, that perhaps the state and the federal government turned to Jonestown, and some of its intelligence connections we're going to talk about, we're going to hear about very shortly, that basically they simply switched their attentions to Jonestown.
Now, unfortunately, due to time constraints, we're not going to be able to cover all of Jonestown tonight, probably because Jonestown, the story, has gotten so vast since the initial events. Probably we're going to maybe even be carrying Jonestown over to yet another in a series of Radio Free America broadcasts on mind control. However, we are going to indeed introduce you at least to the beginning of the Jonestown story, because, again, looking at what had happened in California at that time, and by the by, these were not isolated incidents, at the same time as we're talking about Dr. Lewis Jolly West, who had been working for the CIA and was Jack Ruby's psychiatrist, while Lewis Jolly West is putting together his Violence Center proposal and talking about working with poor people and prisoners and things like that. We have people like Colson Westbrook, a previous CIA agent, going into the prison systems of California to work with men like Donald DeFreeze, who later became Field Marshal Sin Q, leader of the Symbionese Liberation Army, who then proceeded to kidnap William Randolph Hearst's daughter and brainwash her. Numerous other incidents of collaboration or a strange collusion between the intelligence network and the SLA, and other acts of terrorism going on in California at about this time, the early 1970s.
Interesting connecting link. The F. Lee Bailey, who was Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Stranglers attorney, also represented Patty Hearst, and the whole question of brainwashing and mind control became front and center in the Patty Hearst trial. There was a lot of speculation that one of the reasons why this daughter of privilege, so to speak, went along with the SLA was that she had, in fact, been brainwashed. And the Patty Hearst syndrome is receiving a lot of discussion even to this day in connection with hostages. So let's recap a little bit about some of the things that we've looked at here. Now, we took a look at Candy Jones, a CIA courier who was basically being programmed to hate black people. We then looked at the efforts of Irvin, Mark, and Sweet, who basically said that, well, some blacks riot and some don't. Perhaps the ones who riot have a neurological deficiency in the brain. We better study it. Then we see Lewis Jolly and West connected to both the CIA, connected to Jack Ruby in the Kennedy investigation. He, along with some of the Harvard team of Irvin, Mark, and Sweet, are going to set up this Center for the Study of for the Prevention of Violent Behavior. And chief among this, one of the chief foci of their investigation was, again, to study black people and to find out why some of them, quote, run amok, unquote. Now recall that the People's Temple, only the leadership was white. The vast majority of the People's Temple was black. Recall also that Jim Jones became, among other things, the housing commissioner of San Francisco, that Tim Stone, when he was a DA up in Ukiah, basically was responsible for getting a lot of people who were from mental patients, orphans, people who were otherwise wards of the state, into the People's Temple, and we see tentacles from the People's Temple running into some of the same institutions that were being talked about in connection with the UCLA Institute.
Again, and something that will be covered in greater depth undoubtedly when we deal with Jonestown on a longer basis, perhaps in the next Radio Free America. Jim Jones also had connections to the previously mentioned Dan Mitrione, who, among other things, was down in South and Central America at the time that perhaps the early days, the early schemes for Jonestown were being laid down. As we mentioned earlier, Dan Mitrione was the former Midwestern police chief who went to work indirectly for the intelligence networks and the CIA and was teaching the police and security forces in Uruguay and Brazil and other places essentially how to torture and how to brainwash and how to terrorize the local populace for the purposes of establishing and perpetuating the quote-unquote national security state. So bear some of these things in mind. We'll be talking about them again at more length. However, we are going to take a short break before we play the tape, at which point we can come back and introduce it.
One thing I think is worth mentioning is let's take a look at some of the California connections here. Now, both Gilbert Jensen and Marshall Berger, who were the two controllers and programmers of Candy Jones, were located in California. Although she was based in New York, she flew to California for her programming and for most of her instructions. And now, of course, the whole Robert Kennedy case took place out here. Notice that James Earl Ray apparently went down to Los Angeles, and that's where he became involved with hypnosis. We've taken a look at the Neuropsychiatric Institute down there, their proposed study for the Center for the Study of Violent Behavior, and that, of course, was going to be down in Southern California. And, of course, Ronald Reagan and Dr. Earl Bryan are from California. Earl Bryan hooked up with Mies.
Don't forget Artie Bremer and his sister.
Arthur Bremer and his sister, and of course the People's Temple was from California initially. The Symbionese Liberation Army, of course, was from California, and I think it's worth mentioning here too that the first researcher in the country really to focus on the California connection, on the terror, and on mind control specifically was May Brussel, whose work is featured on this station, and May basically was the first also to suggest that perhaps the UCLA Center, the Center for the Study and Prevention of Violent Behavior, was simply moved down to Guyana under the auspices of Jim Jones. Also, a little bit about the chronology of Jim Jones. Jones was in Brazil in 1962 at the time that Dan Mitrione was down there teaching torture. They were childhood friends, apparently. They'd grown up in the same town. And while Jim Jones had taken his, I guess you'd call it his People's Temple Roadshow, he studied Father Divine, a very famous black evangelist who made a great deal of money and achieved a lot of fame and power as well. And Jim Jones studied his techniques and the various scams that Father Divine used. And apparently, it is impossible to pull one of these things off, one of these scams off, where you sort of pull these circus tent tricks of pulling a cancer out of somebody's mouth or nose, it's actually a piece of liver, without the cooperation of the local authorities. And Dan Mitrione was police chief was basically, I think it was sheriff in Bloomington, where Jim Jones was doing some of his work. I'm not sure exactly which city Mitrione was chief of police in, but much of Jones' work was done in that town, and by implication probably involved a little bit of cooperation from Dan Mitrione.